The evening in Cairo unfolded like a quiet symphony, each note echoing across the ancient city. As the golden rays of the setting sun stretched across the sky, the bustling streets slowly began to calm, their usual noise softening as twilight descended. The air, heavy with the remnants of a long, warm day, seemed to hold its breath. Amidst the chatter of vendors and the hum of passing cars, one could catch a fleeting moment where time stood still. Cairo, with all its vibrancy, was about to reveal a softer, more contemplative side. In the heart of the city, standing stoic amidst the frenetic energy of Cairo's downtown, was the Al-Hadid Church. Its stone walls, worn smooth by centuries of use, exuded a quiet dignity. The bell tower, which had stood guard over the area for generations, now cast long shadows as the sun dipped lower. The church, a sacred space for Egypt's Coptic Christians, had witnessed countless moments of prayer, peace, and sorrow. On this particular evening, however, something extraordinary was about to happen within its ancient walls. The church courtyard was alive with the sound of children's laughter, their carefree voices bouncing off the stone walls. Parents gathered in small groups, their conversations blending with the soft clinking of tea glasses. The scent of incense drifted through the air, mingling with the faint perfume of jasmine blooming in the evening air. As the last light of the day faded, the courtyard's warm glow transformed into a serene, almost sacred calm. The church doors, framed by intricate ironwork, were ajar, welcoming the faithful who were slowly filtering in for the evening service. Inside the church, the atmosphere was hushed, expectant. The priests moved about with practiced precision, arranging candles, hymns, and sacred texts in preparation for the service. The flicker of the candles cast dancing shadows on the centuries-old walls, creating an ethereal glow. The sound of whispered prayers and the rustle of robes filled the air as the congregation settled into the pews. It was a place of quiet reflection, a moment to leave behind the noise of the world and find solace in the simplicity of devotion. As the first notes of the hymns began to fill the church, a sense of calm spread over the congregation. The voices of the choir rose in harmony, echoing through the high, vaulted ceiling. The church, though ancient, seemed alive with the energy of its community, a living testament to the faith and traditions of those who gathered there. The peaceful reverence was palpable, and no one could have predicted that, in just a few moments, this serene atmosphere would be disrupted by an unexpected arrival, one that would change the course of the evening. As the evening unfolded in Cairo, the stillness within the Al-Hadid Church was almost sacred. The low hum of prayer, the flicker of candlelight, and the faint scent of incense created an atmosphere of reverence, where time seemed to slow. The congregation, absorbed in the ancient hymns and rituals, remained unaware that tonight would carry an unexpected turn. The world outside, bustling with the everyday chaos of Cairo, seemed far removed from this sacred space. Yet, as the soft evening light faded into the embrace of night, a solitary figure approached the church, his presence almost unnoticed by the busy world around him. Stephen Curry, a name synonymous with the fast-paced energy of basketball courts, was far from his usual environment. His arrival in Cairo had been kept under wraps, a deliberate choice to avoid the spotlight that inevitably followed him. In the quiet, reflective moment of the evening, he arrived not as a basketball superstar, but as a man seeking something more, something that lay far beyond the arenas of competition and fame. His SUV pulled gently to a stop in front of the church, its engine purring quietly as the driver cut the ignition. As the door opened, the cool evening air wrapped around him, brushing against his face and carrying the distant sounds of Cairo's vibrant streets. For a brief moment, Stephen stood still, absorbing the peace that radiated from the ancient building. There was a subtle hesitation in his movement, a deep breath as he mentally prepared himself for what was to come. It wasn't his usual routine of loud crowds and cheers tonight. He would step into the unknown, into a world of stillness and introspection. Wearing a simple, dark jacket and jeans, he blended seamlessly with the environment. His identity, while famous worldwide, was obscured by the quiet humility of his arrival. Without entourage or fanfare, he walked towards the church, his footsteps measured and deliberate, his gaze focused forward, as though the very act of walking toward this place of worship was a form of personal pilgrimage. The massive iron doors of the church opened slowly before him, and the soft glow from within spilled into the dimming Cairo streets. As he entered, there was no dramatic interruption. His presence, though significant, was met with the same serenity that defined the space. Those within the church, absorbed in their prayers and the evening hymns, hardly noticed the tall figure slipping in at the back. Stephen moved quietly through the rows of pews, his every step resonating with an unspoken desire for connection and reflection. There were no flashing cameras, no excited whispers, just a lone figure in search of solace among strangers. He found an empty seat near the back, seated among the congregation as if he had always belonged there, just another face in the crowd. His gaze wandered upward, catching the play of candlelight against the ancient stone walls, and for a moment, the weight of his public life seemed far away. The world of endorsements, championships, and the constant scrutiny of the media faded into the background as he settled into the quiet space, his mind reflecting on his own personal journey. It was a far cry from the basketball courts he was used to, but this was precisely what he needed. A chance to experience something beyond the demands of his high-profile career, a chance to find peace, perhaps, in the humility of this unexpected place. The soft murmur of prayer filled the air, and the flickering candlelight seemed to dance across the ancient stone walls of the Al-Hadid church. It was a serene, almost sacred atmosphere, where every hymn, every word uttered by the priest, seemed to carry weight and meaning. The congregation, a collection of individuals from different walks of life, had settled into a quiet reverence, lost in the rhythm of the service. It was a moment of peace, a refuge from the noise of the outside world. But that evening, something unexpected was about to unfold, a subtle disruption in the calm that would leave everyone in the room in stunned silence. As the priest's voice echoed softly, leading the congregation through the evening prayers, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open, a sound that was barely audible amidst the sacred stillness. It was a small noise, almost insignificant, but in the silence of the church, it carried far more weight than anyone could have anticipated. Heads turned instinctively, some with mild curiosity, others with a sense of annoyance at the disruption. But then, as the figure in the doorway emerged, all whispers and murmurs ceased. At first, no one recognized him. He was dressed in a simple, dark jacket and jeans, his attire unremarkable, blending seamlessly with the ordinary members of the congregation. But it was his presence, something intangible yet undeniable, that commanded attention. The figure stepped into the church with quiet confidence, his movements steady and deliberate. His tall frame stood out against the backdrop of the humble surroundings. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to shift. There was an energy in the room that hadn't been there before, a sudden tension that made the already heavy silence even more palpable. The man walked slowly through the aisle, his steps measured and unhurried. As he passed the rows of pews, those closest to him exchanged uncertain glances. Was this just another visitor, or was this someone important? The congregation couldn't quite place him. His face was unfamiliar, but there was something about the way he carried himself that seemed out of the ordinary. There was no entourage behind him, no flashy display of wealth or power, just this lone figure, walking with purpose. It wasn't until he reached the back of the church and took a seat, quietly lowering himself onto the pew, that the murmurs began. Whispers rippled through the crowd, gradually spreading from one person to the next. It was then that people began to recognize him. The face, the build, the unmistakable confidence, it all began to click. This was no ordinary man. This was Stephen Curry, one of the most celebrated basketball players in the world. His presence in this sacred place, in a church filled with Egyptian Copts, seemed almost surreal. A man whose life was constantly under the glare of media and public scrutiny, now quietly blending in with the congregation as if he were just another person seeking solace in a moment of peace. His arrival, unexpected and unannounced, carried with it a sense of humility that left those who recognized him stunned into silence. The church, which had been filled with the hum of routine and prayer, now seemed to hold its breath, the weight of this unexpected moment settling over everyone in the room. Stephen Curry, a man known for his extraordinary talent on the basketball court, had become an unlikely figure in this quiet place of worship. And yet there he was, seated among the faithful, his presence a reminder that even the most famous among us seek peace and reflection in the most unlikely of places. For those who had recognized him, it was a moment that would stay with them forever, a reminder that even the greatest of public figures can find solace in the simplest of moments, in the most humble of settings. Stephen Curry sat quietly in the back of the Al-Hadid church, his tall frame almost lost in the shadows of the stone pillars. The service continued around him, the rhythm of the hymns and prayers filling the air. But to him, everything else seemed distant, faint, like a muted hum at the edge of his awareness. His mind, usually busy with the fast pace of his basketball career, the constant media coverage, and the demands of his public persona, had slowed. Here, in this ancient place of worship, surrounded by the soft glow of candles and the low murmur of voices, he felt a profound stillness that he hadn't experienced in a long time. For Stephen, the journey to Egypt had not been about basketball, fame, or endorsements. It had been about something much deeper. His life had been one of constant motion, of striving for perfection on the court and balancing the pressures of being in the public eye. But recently, something had shifted. There had been moments when he felt disconnected not from his faith, but from the world around him. The constant noise, the constant demands for his attention, had begun to wear on him. He had found himself longing for something that could ground him, that could help him find clarity again. He had come to this church not for the attention, not for any grand gesture, but because he needed peace. The journey had been quiet, unannounced, and unknown to most of the world. In a way, it felt like a small rebellion against the life he led, an act of reclaiming a moment of stillness, of searching for meaning without the weight of expectations. No cameras, no fans, no media frenzy, just him, alone in a sacred space, far from the prying eyes that always seemed to be watching. As the service progressed, Stephen closed his eyes, letting the words of the hymns wash over him. There was something powerful in the sound of the congregation singing, in the unity of voices, the way the music seemed to echo off the ancient walls of the church. The voices of the choir, though distant, filled him with a quiet sense of connection to something much larger than himself. In this moment he realized how small his world had become, how insular his focus had become, fixated on the next game, the next championship, the next milestone. Here, in the presence of something so ancient, so full of history and faith, he felt both insignificant and incredibly connected. He had spent years perfecting his craft on the basketball court, pushing his limits, always striving for more. But here, there was no need to prove anything. No game to win, no accolades to chase. It was a rare and almost overwhelming sense of freedom. It wasn't about what he could do, but about who he could be. As he sat there, surrounded by the people of Cairo, he could feel the weight of his life's pressure start to slip away. The anxiety, the expectations, the constant pursuit of success, everything seemed distant. It was a humbling feeling, one that reminded him of the importance of slowing down, of taking time to reflect. A soft warmth began to spread through him, not from the flickering candles, but from a deeper place within. It was a quiet assurance, a knowing that he was where he needed to be. He wasn't Stephen Curry, the basketball player, here in this moment. He was simply Stephen, a man seeking to find peace, seeking connection to something greater than himself. The church, people, the prayers, all of it felt like a gentle reminder of life's greater purpose. The service continued, but in Stephen's heart, something had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it was profound. It was as though he had finally found a space to breathe, to be present, to listen not to the world around him but to the quiet voice within. His silent connection to the church, to the people, to the ancient walls that had witnessed so much history, felt like the first step toward understanding something deeper about himself. No one around him knew the internal journey he was undergoing in that quiet moment. No one knew the struggle he had been feeling, the questions he had been asking himself about his purpose, about the nature of success and fulfillment. But as he sat there, surrounded by the stillness, he felt a sense of peace that was unlike anything he had ever known. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't chasing anything. He was simply being, existing in the quiet sanctuary of the church, feeling a deep, unspoken connection to the world around him. As the final hymn echoed through the church, a hushed stillness fell over the congregation. Stephen Curry sat in his seat at the back of the room, his thoughts swirling. The words of the service had touched him more deeply than he had expected. There was a quiet peace in the space, and he felt the weight of the past few months slowly lift from his shoulders. The world, for a brief moment, seemed far away. But as the service came to a close, a gentle but firm voice interrupted the silence. It was Father Yusuf, the elderly priest who had been leading the service. His calm demeanor had already set the tone for the evening, but now, as the last hymn faded, he turned toward the congregation and invited them to share their reflections. It was a customary practice, but no one had anticipated what would come next. Stephen felt an inexplicable pull to stand to speak. He wasn't sure why, but in the stillness of the moment, something inside him stirred a voice that had been quieted for too long, urging him to speak. Taking a deep breath, Stephen stood slowly, the room falling into an expectant silence. His height, always commanding on the basketball court, felt almost fragile here in this sacred space. His shoes made a soft noise on the stone floor as he made his way to the front, his heart pounding a little harder with each step. He hadn't planned this, hadn't thought he would be the one to speak. But now, standing before the congregation, he realized there was no turning back. He had come here seeking peace, seeking clarity, but it seemed as though something had found him in return. As he stood at the front, Stephen paused for a moment, looking out over the faces of the congregation. Their eyes were filled with curiosity, but there was something else there too, an understanding. He didn't need to explain who he was. They knew who he was. This was not about basketball, not about his public persona. This was about something deeper, something more human. He cleared his throat, his voice breaking the silence with its quiet intensity. "I want to thank you all for allowing me to be here tonight," he began, his words slow and deliberate. His voice, though steady, held an emotional weight that surprised even him. "I came here not as a basketball player, not as someone famous or powerful. I came here as a man who has been searching for peace, for meaning, for something that transcends all the noise in my life." He paused again, glancing at the faces before him. He could see the reflection of his own struggles in their eyes, their understanding, their shared humanity. "You know, in my life I've always been in the spotlight. I've always been in motion chasing the next goal, the next game, the next achievement. But recently I've found that the more I chase, the less I seem to understand about what truly matters." Stephen's words hung in the air, heavy with honesty. He wasn't speaking about his career, his championships, or his fame. He was speaking about the internal battles, the doubts, the moments of vulnerability that everyone, even the most powerful and celebrated individuals, must face. The room was silent, hanging on every word. "I've been struggling with something in my heart," he continued, his voice softer now. "I've been trying to figure out what it all means. I've realized that, for so long, I've measured my worth by my success, by my ability to perform. But what happens when that's not enough? What happens when the victories no longer fill the emptiness inside?" He looked down, gathering his thoughts, and when he spoke again, there was a deep sincerity in his voice. "I came here tonight not for answers, but to listen. To be present. To remind myself that faith isn't about being strong, about having it all together. It's about holding on when you feel weak, when you're at your lowest. It's about trusting in something greater than yourself." A few tears shimmered in his eyes, and the congregation, sensing his vulnerability, felt the rawness of his words. Stephen's voice broke slightly as he finished. "I don't have all the answers, but I know that hope is real, and it's in moments like these when we share in this faith, together, that we find strength. I'm grateful for all of you for letting me be a part of this." There was a moment of complete silence, as if the whole church had held its breath. The weight of his words lingered in the air like the fading notes of the hymn. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the honesty, the vulnerability, that had moved the room. Stephen Curry, a man known for his strength and ability to perform under pressure, had laid bare his struggles and doubts. In doing so, he had connected with every single person in that room, each one of them, regardless of their background or faith, recognizing the humanity in his speech. A young woman in the choir loft began to hum softly, and others soon joined in. It was an old hymn, one that had been passed down through generations, a melody of unity and hope. The sound filled the church, echoing off the stone walls, creating a shared space of comfort and solace. As the song grew louder, Stephen closed his eyes, allowing the music to carry him, feeling the collective strength of the congregation in each note. It was a moment of profound connection, one that transcended all the barriers that typically divided people. Stephen Curry had come to the church seeking peace, but in that vulnerable speech, he had found something far greater, a shared understanding of the human experience, a reminder that even the most celebrated among us are just as fragile and in need of connection as anyone else. The words, simple yet profound, would stay with everyone in that room for a long time, a moment that would never be forgotten. As the final hymn echoed through the church, the weight of the moment seemed to settle into the very stones of the old building. The congregation had been moved by Stephen Curry's speech, his vulnerability leaving a lasting impression. The air, once thick with tension, now hummed with a quiet sense of unity. It was a rare moment, one that transcended the usual barriers of class, fame, or creed. The ordinary and the extraordinary had met in the shared space of faith, and for a few fleeting minutes, nothing else mattered. Stephen stood at the front of the church, his head slightly bowed, his thoughts still drifting with the fading notes of the hymn. He had spoken from the heart, sharing pieces of himself that he rarely allowed the world to see. The walls of the church seemed to hold him in a way that nothing in his life ever had. For the first time in a long while he felt truly present, stripped of the constant noise of the world around him. It was peaceful, it was humbling, and it was something he had longed for without even realizing it. As the congregation began to stir, slowly rising from their seats, Stephen remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the flickering candles at the altar. The lights seemed to dance in rhythm with his heartbeat, casting long shadows on the ancient stone walls. He wasn't ready to leave just yet. He wasn't ready to return to the rush of the outside world. He had come here seeking solace, but in the process he had found something more, a sense of connection, a feeling of belonging that had eluded him for so long. It was then that he noticed the small figure at the edge of his vision. A young boy, no older than 10, stood hesitantly at the side of the aisle, clutching a small bouquet of white flowers in his hands. The child's eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and uncertainty, his small feet barely making a sound on the stone floor as he inched forward. Stephen's heart softened at the sight of him. The boy, no taller than his waist, seemed to carry the weight of the world in his tiny hands, and yet he moved with a quiet determination. The congregation had fallen into a gentle murmur, the final whispers of the evening slowly fading as the boy made his way toward the front. There was no rush, no urgency, just the slow, deliberate steps of a child, guided by something deeper than curiosity. Stephen watched him approach, his heart swelling with a sense of gratitude he couldn't quite explain. The child wasn't just delivering flowers, he was delivering something far more profound, something that words couldn't quite capture. When the boy reached Stephen, he extended the bouquet with trembling hands. His voice, barely audible, broke the silence. "These are for you," he said, his eyes never leaving the ground. The flowers were simple, small white blossoms tied together with a fraying ribbon, but to Stephen, they felt like a gift from the heart. He could feel the sincerity in the child's gesture, the quiet reverence in his eyes. It was as if the boy understood something about Stephen's journey that even the man himself hadn't fully grasped. Stephen smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. He reached out and gently accepted the flowers, his large hands cradling the delicate bouquet. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice breaking with unexpected emotion. It was a simple word, but it carried so much more than gratitude. It was acknowledgement. It was a recognition of the human connection that had transcended everything else. In that moment, the fame, the success, the pressure, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the raw, beautiful simplicity of the gesture before him. The boy stood there for a moment longer, still unsure, as if waiting for something. Stephen's heart softened even further. He knelt down to meet the boy at eye level, his knees creaking slightly under the weight of his actions. He wanted to say something profound, something that would convey the depth of what he was feeling, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a touch so gentle that it seemed to reverberate through the very air between them. "You're brave," Stephen whispered, his voice filled with an unspoken warmth. The boy looked up, his wide eyes meeting Stephen's with a mixture of surprise and wonder. It was a simple statement, but it carried with it an immense amount of weight. In that moment, Stephen saw something in the boy, a quiet strength, determination, a willingness to give something pure, without expectation, to another human being. The boy hesitated, looking up at him with a shy, tentative smile. "No," he said softly, almost in disbelief. "You're brave." Stephen's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded in quiet understanding. "No, it's you," he replied, his voice full of warmth. "It's you who are brave. Never forget that." The moment between them was brief, but it held a depth of meaning that words could scarcely describe. As the boy stepped back, a sense of peace settled over Stephen. It was as if, in that brief exchange, they had both shared something infinitely precious, a connection that transcended all boundaries. The gesture, simple and unassuming, had been a reminder of the inherent goodness in people, the quiet acts of humanity that often go unnoticed in the rush of the world. As the boy turned and returned to his seat, the congregation remained silent, caught in the power of the moment. For Stephen, the gift of the flowers had been more than just a kind gesture. It had been a reminder of the strength that lies in vulnerability, in sharing moments of pure, unfiltered humanity. The boy had offered him something priceless, a simple but profound acknowledgement of his journey, his struggles, and the quiet grace of living with an open heart. When the service finally came to an end, the congregation began to leave, but no one spoke. The silence lingered, heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Stephen Curry, a man used to being in the spotlight, left the church that night with a renewed sense of connection to something far larger than himself. It wasn't the accolades or the applause that he would remember from this night. It was the touching gesture of a child, whose simple offering had touched his soul in ways he could never have imagined.